In 1922, a ship left the French port of Le Havre to journey 3,000 miles across the North Atlantic. On board was a cameraman who had been sent by Albert Kahn on a unique and dangerous mission.
There is a fascinating notion in a lot of Kahn's work is to reach places that are really far away, that no one perhaps was able to reach unless there was a very good reason for doing so. And one was Newfoundland, which was a British colony, not part of Canada until 1949, in which there are two industries. One is timber and the other is fishing, and that's it.
The French had occupied parts of Newfoundland since the 16th century. By the 1920s, they only held on to the small island of Saint-Pierre. But they'd retained local fishing rights, and so every year about 7,000 Frenchmen would spend months in these treacherous seas fishing for cod. In 1922, Kahn's cameraman Lucien Le Saint joined the fishermen. He kept a detailed diary of his voyage.
Saturday, May the 6th, 8 o'clock in the evening. The weather is fine now, completely calm. We are totally surrounded by ice. We've seen icebergs 2 or 3 times the size of our boat. It's both a wonderful and frightening sight.
Le Saint wanted to film all aspects of the fishing process, which at this time still included the use of the ancient technology of hook and line.
As far as I'm aware, this is an absolutely unique piece of film. What we can see is really a system that died probably in the 1930s. So we're really on the brink of a disappearing age, as it were. And the way they fished in those times was by using dories. Now, each dory is like a saucer. It can stack one inside the other. It has no deck. Each schooner that came across from France would have perhaps 10 dories and 24 men. And the idea is they're all lowered into the sea, usually with 2 fishermen in each dory, and off they go, spreading out in a star formation or in a spoke formation. And from their dories, the men would then throw out their hand lines. And they bring the fish back into the mothership where they're pitched back on board.
Lucien Le Saint was the ideal choice for a mission as grueling as this.
Il devait supporter des conditions de temps extrêmement difficiles.
He had to put up with terrible weather. Not only lots of storms, but the cold. It was constantly very cold. There were also problems with food because the food they took on board was very limited. So they just had to eat a lot of fish. His relationship with the men was very good for the simple reason that my grandfather had sea legs. He was never seasick, not even during storms. And he joined in the fishermen's lives because he was enduring the same conditions as they were.
Le Saint had established a reputation as an exceptionally intrepid cameraman. He'd covered the First World War, had specialized in aerial photography, and had traveled all over the world.
Lucien Le Saint était sans doute de toute l'équipe des opérateurs d'Albert Kahn.
Lucien Le Saint was without a doubt the most cinematic of Kahn's cameramen. For example, he never took color autochromes. He was truly a professional film cameraman, both in his training and his taste. And that's clear in his framing, in the technical quality of the images he delivered. He knew all the tricks of the camera and was excellent at his craft. He worked well even in really tough situations, like being out at sea.
Saturday, May the 13th. These men work like slaves. Sometimes they get lost in the fog, dragged off by the currents which take them out of sight of their ship. And every time we see that happening, If the weather is terrible, it's goodbye to those little boats. Thursday, May the 25th. Today, we rescued 2 men who had been lost at sea for 48 hours.
Once they'd brought the cod aboard, the men started preparing the fish by gutting them and storing them in salt water. Many of the fishermen would sleep for just an hour or 2 a day.
This is cold work. A man's hands could freeze in perhaps half an hour or so. But it was difficult to work in the fiddly conditions of either baiting hooks or gutting fish if you're wearing gloves. So generally speaking, as you can see in these pictures, people haven't got protected hands at all. And one can only imagine the damage they did to their hands after a season of fishing in these very difficult conditions.
Joining the fishing fleet was a hospital boat, the only place the men received any sort of medical attention. The doctor would perform operations of every kind, from tooth extractions to amputations.
The conditions were such that the likelihood of disease was extremely strong, but also there were injuries caused perhaps by puncture wounds from fish or from knives, and these would become very infected in the filthy environment of fish gutting. One has to remember there's a lot of gurry and pip, as it's called, lying around. That's the sort of fish mess. And these would infect, and we're still 20 years off antibiotics, and so the only way the doctors could deal with these appalling injuries was to drain them as best they could and hope for the best.
Thursday, May the 25th. We've seen quite a few ships, bringing with them about a dozen sick men, a lot with leg injuries from getting in and out of the dories, but mostly for infected hands. The doctor had to drain 5 infected wounds today, and tomorrow he'll have to cut off a man's thumb. The fishermen stay out here 3 or 4 months without fresh water to wash themselves because the supply is limited. It's a tough life.
The only refuge for the French fishermen was their country's last remaining colonial outpost here, the tiny island of Saint-Pierre. It's still a department of France to this day. It trades in euros and imports food from the mother country. Le Saint's camera observed the lives of the islanders, including a man riding a cart powered by a pair of Newfoundland dogs. Le Saint took a shine to the animals and bought himself a puppy, which he named Doris, after the small boats.
Wednesday, June the 14th. We arrived at Saint-Pierre on the 10th. We've spent 4 days here for ship repairs. I'm taking the opportunity to film some great views of the coastline and the drying of the cod.
While filming off Newfoundland, Le Saint saw the future of the fishing industry. Steam engine trawlers using huge nets. Le Saint's images of the new trawlers show the eclipse of ancient fishing methods by the industrial-scale exploitation of the seas. Throughout his project, Kahn wanted to show how traditional ways of life were being displaced by the forces of modernity, a process all too visible in the images shot during the 1920s in the French colonies of North Africa.